Welcome to the Fox One Corp series of training videos. I'm Dave Springford. Visit me online at www.foxonecorp.com. In this part 2 of the Vario parameters video, I want to take a look at setting up the graphic display. So the first thing that we want to do now that we've finished looking at all these parameters and filters is we want to go into the setup and the hardware menu. And the first place we want to look is in this variometer menu. In here, the first thing we can see is TE compensation. This setting is used to differentiate between compensation with a TE probe and electronic compensation. If we are connected to a TE probe, then this value must be set to 0% and there's no adjustment that can be made. The response that the Vario gets is directly related to the probe that you have and the length of the tubes, and there's no filtering, no changes that can be done. If your Vario doesn't seem to be compensated properly when using the tube, then your next option is to change to electronic compensation. And when using electronic compensation, we want to have this value set to 100%. That's the starting point. Besides setting this to 100%, electronic compensation also requires a change of the pneumatic tubing at the back of the Vario. Instead of connecting 3 separate tubes, total pressure, static pressure, and the pressure from the TE probe, we would connect total to the total port, and then we would connect static to both the static and the TE ports on the back of the Vario. Then we can start making adjustments to the compensation by changing the 100% value up or down depending on what's happening. To assess this, we have to do a test flight, and that test flight has to be in smooth air. So you need to go up early in the morning or late in the evening on, say, a 3,000-foot tow and do a bunch of dives and pull-ups to try and fine-tune this. The TE compensation value will increase from 100% if you're undercompensated. So undercompensated means if you pull up, you get a stick thermal and the Vario needle goes up further than it should. And so in this case, you would increase the value to 110 or 120% and then go through another cycle of your dive and climb. It should be noted that when you do this, a properly compensated Vario, when you transition from the dive into the climb, should initially show a sink rate equivalent to the actual glider's sink rate in still air. And typically this is going to be about 1.5 to 2 knots. And so you should not try and compensate out that slightly below zero indication that you get from your Vario. If you pull up and your Vario indicates -5 knots, then you're overcompensated and you need to adjust the value of your compensation down. And so you would set it to a value less than 100. Other things in this menu that we want to take a look at are these digital inputs. The first one, VP, that represents Vario priority. You can wire a separate switch onto your panel or onto your stick that's a Vario priority button. And whenever this switch is set, whenever that circuit is closed to ground, your Vario will always be in Vario mode. And so this is helpful if you're flying a flapped ship and you have a switch on your flaps that every time you move your flaps into thermaling position, you change from cruise mode to climb mode. But sometimes you want to be cruising, say with your flaps in your best L over D setting, but you still want to have Vario instead of cruise information, and your flap switch has now forced it back into cruise mode. So you can flip this Vario priority switch and put it back into Vario mode while you're hunting or cruising at best L over D. SC, speed command, this is where we would set, we've already talked in the first video about the off setting for our speed command or our automatic GPS and speed and G load. If we have the automatic speed command set to off, then we need to tell it what to expect. And we have a few options here. We can have not in use, in which case we're on automatic mode. We can have speed command on-off switch. So this would be throw switch on your stick, push it forward for climb mode, pull it backwards for speed command mode, or vice versa, and you will get changes on your Vario. If, for example, your switch is mounted such that forward is climb mode and you want forward to be cruise mode, then all you have to do is click this invert button, and what that will do is it will switch the modes so that forward is now cruise and rearwards is climb. So you don't have to rewire the switch or take the switch out and rotate it 180 degrees. You can just select that invert button and do the same thing as physically moving the switch 180 degrees. Speed command flap switch. So again, a switch that you would put on your flaps. And speed command toggle button. If you use an LX9000 remote stick, this is the setting that you need. It's a little one push of the button. Every time you push the button, it closes to ground. It closes the circuit to ground while the button is pushed. And the toggle button setting here tells it every time you get a instantaneous grounding of that circuit, switch modes. So instead of being in a fixed position switch, it's just a toggle switch. The other 4 digital inputs, those are, if you watch my video on how to wire and connect the LX9000, those are the 5 wires that are labeled digital inputs, or IN1 through IN4, and then there's an IN ground. And so if you put a switch between input 1 and ground, and every time you move the switch, then you can have it perform a specific function. It can be speed command, as some of these, or vario priority, and it can also be a gear switch or an air brakes or a water valve, anything like that. The water valve is interesting because you can set dump rate in the computer, and if every time digital input 1 connected to that water valve switch is toggled, it will now start counting down how much water you have dumped based on the time between when you open and close the valve, and this switch senses the open and close position. So those 4 switches can be used for any of those items. Next thing to take a look at is the indicator setup. In your menu, you will have this one. You can see there are 3 indicators showing that we have possibly 3 Varios connected to this LX9000. But what it's here to do really is just show us the different indicators that can be connected. Some of the early Gen 1, they had the old LCD, the gray screen that came with the LX5000 and 7000. And so there's still the ability to adjust that. Indicator and V80 indicator. We'll look at the V80 indicator because it has the settings that I want to look at. And so in here, the first thing we can see is up on the top, Vario needle. And so in here, this is going to define when your cruise climb switch or your automatic setting is in climb mode, what's the needle going to show you? And really, I think if you're in climb mode, you should have it set to Vario. But you have other options. It can be set to speed command. It can be set to netto or relative netto. So those are your options. And so I'm always going to leave that set to Vario. Speed command, when you've toggled your switch into speed command mode, what do you want the Vario to show? Personally, I don't want to see Vario. It doesn't really do much for me. I don't want to see speed command. We're going to set that somewhere different. What I want to see is netto. So I always have the speed command needle showing me netto indications, particularly on those weekdays when you're hunting for thermals. It's really handy to be able to see netto here. You could set it to relative netto, in which case it would give you your climb rate. Then we have 4 possible lines of data that we can show on our Vario. And so these lines we can see on our display. And what is given on each of those lines is adjustable through what we set here. And so one other thing that we can take a look at is nav boxes displayed. We can change this anywhere from 1 to 4 nav boxes. If we have 4 nav boxes, here's one caution I'll give you. If you have 4 nav boxes set up, then whether you're in cruise mode or you're in climb mode, you must have the same 4 nav boxes on both screens. And so whether you're in cruise mode or climb mode on your Vario is indicated by this little icon in the middle. If you're in climb mode, you have a circling arrow, and if you're in cruise mode, you have a straight line arrow. 4 nav boxes, you'll have the same thing on your cruise and your climb screen. If you go to 3 nav boxes, one thing you'll notice is that you have third line and third line speed command. This allows you to set different information during cruise on your Vario than you have during climb. You can select what you want here. There are a lot of options: average Vario, time, flight time, task remaining time, netto value, outside temperature, altitude, distance, arrival altitude. That's a good one to have set in one of the boxes. It will give you your height over glide slope to the next point. If you're navigating to a waypoint, it gives you that waypoint. If you're in task mode, it will give you your glide, your height over glide to the next waypoint in the task. True airspeed, 60-minute speed, so your achieved task speed for the last 60 minutes. Altitude in meters, flight level, your thermal overall average, indicated airspeed, voltage, average netto, height, total altitude, IGC altitude. If you're flying a world championships or a FAI contest, this is nice to have. It tells you what altitude. I suppose even in US contests, it's good because it tells you what altitude your IGC recorder is actually recording. And so when it comes for start and finish heights, it's important to know what you're actually submitting to the score. So those are the options that are available, and all of those same options are available for the second line, third line, fourth line. So I won't go through them again, but you can set what you want on each of those lines. And only if you have 3 or less lines, then you can change what you get on cruise mode versus climb mode. So if we go down to 2 boxes, then we have a first and second line for Vario mode, and we have a first and second line for speed command mode. And this is the way, for example, the V5 or the V9 Vario would be set. It only has 2 possible lines, not 4. So the next thing we want to take a look at is all these symbols. What are the various symbols that are available on our Vario? And whether it's a V5, V9, or a V8, all of these basic symbols are the same to start with. So the first thing is the MCCReady symbol. If I toggle on MCCReady, the MCCReady symbol is this blue arrow, and that tells us what our MCCReady value is set to. Just with a glance of the Vario, we can see where the MCCReady has been set. The diamond, so that's the red diamond at 2 meters per second in the picture, that can be set to show various things. And so typically it's set to average, showing you your window or your 20-second average. And so it's in the picture the same as the top line average Vario. You can set it to netto, so it will be showing you netto changes. You can set it to G meter, so now it'll act like a G meter for you. So those are your options. Typically I have that set to average. Thermal. I always have thermal selected because I like to know what's my overall thermal climb. The thermal average is indicated by this green T right now sitting at the 0 mark. And I like having both the green T and the red diamond because I think they work together. As long as the red diamond is above the green T, that says I'm currently climbing better than the climb rate I've achieved so far in the thermal, so I'm actually doing well. If this red diamond starts to drop below the thermal average, then the thermal is weakening, and it's probably time to leave to be efficient. Another checkbox we have is FLARM. And with FLARM, what that does is it allows us to show FLARM clock display on the Vario whenever we get a collision warning. So that FLARM clock display will look like this. In this picture, for example, we have traffic at 12 o'clock indicated by that blue dot. It's 175 meters above us. Should say these units can be set to whatever you want them to in your normal unit settings. It's just that the pictures available on the web are all the metric version. The above is indicated by this arrow pointing up. If it was below you, there'd be a mirror image arrow pointing down. And the traffic is 1.2 kilometers away from you. And we said it's at 12 o'clock. Going back to our regular Vario display, one other thing we want to take a look at is this setting here. And the bar is what occurs on the right side. And so this is the bar. And in here, we can display various parameters. So right now it's set to no bar. We can set it to a speed to fly bar. And if it's set to speed to fly, it will have red arrows pointing upwards, telling us to slow down when we're in cruise mode, and blue bars pointing downwards, telling us to accelerate in sync when we're in cruise mode. We can get an idea of that with the gray chevrons that we can see in here. The next option is a flap tape. So we can have the flap tape displayed on the Vario, telling us in which flap setting we should be based on our current speed and wing loading. We can have a speed tape showing us our current speed. We can have both a flap and a speed tape. Typically, I have this set to the speed to fly bar. Another thing we can do is the dial style. I do not have a graphic of this, but we can change the dial from linear to non-linear. And so what that does is it changes the spacing between the values on the display so that the lower climb rates are spaced further apart. So for example, 1 meter per second might be where the 2 is, and 2 is where the 3 is, and then you have 4 and 5. And so at the low end of the scale, you have better discrimination of the climb rate. Needle style, we have options here of thick, medium, and thin. The medium is as it's currently shown with the red triangle at about 0.5 meters per second is our standard Vario needle in this case. And then finally, the other option we have is to change the colors or the black-white of the display. And so we have 4 options under this. We can have black-black as it would appear in the top left here with a black outer ring and black inner scale. We can have black-white, so it would appear with black on the inside and white on the Vario scale. We can have white-white, as in the top right, and we can have white-black, in which case we'd have white on the inside and black on the outside. So you can set that to your preference. Hopefully you've learned something new about your LX computer today. Visit me online at www.fox1corp.com and subscribe to this Fox One Corp YouTube channel.